Please be seated. I watched a wonderful documentary a couple of weeks ago. It was titled 1968, the year that changed America. It was 50 years ago, and what a year. The Vietnam War was going on, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the struggle for civil rights, and then the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, followed by a presidential race while the war was still going on. It was a rough year, and the news reports were all about war and death, violence. And I saw these pictures, I was watching this, and even the presidential race at that time, there was so much anger and struggle. There was a sense by the end of the year, a sense from the people that they asked and different people that I was listening to, that in this country there seemed to be a sense of loss and hopelessness. Now, if we go back centuries before that, before any of that happened in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We've been reading Genesis over the last few weeks. And God created the heavens and the earth, and then he created Adam and Eve, and he placed them in this beautiful, beautiful Garden of Eden, and we all know the story. That's beautiful garden. They could have what they want. They could live a lovely life, but they could not eat from this tree of knowledge, which just happened to be right in the center of the garden. And also, God created Adam and Eve, but seemed to have also created this serpent that also happened to be in the middle of the garden. And we know what happens. Eve and the serpent start to chat, and she eats something, hands it to Adam. God finds out, and they are banished from the garden. And their lives have to begin again. Humankind has now moved into the world. A world where sin now exists and where the struggle against sin begins. For them, for Adam and Eve, I imagine what they were facing was a little bit of a life of mystery. What was going to happen? Where were they going to go? Despair, fear. I can only imagine what they were feeling. And now let's move ahead. It was December now of 1968, and the year was coming to an end. Reporter Dan Rather was interviewing Ethel Kennedy right before Christmas, and they were talking about how they were going to look at Christmas a little differently this year. And he went on to say that they were really ending a dramatic year filled with trauma and devastating events, probably one of the most traumatic years in American history. But there was one more event. On December 21st of 1968, people gathered around their televisions and watched the launch of Apollo 8. 3 astronauts were going to be the first humans to ever go into space, orbit the moon, and then come back home, hopefully safely. It seemed unbelievable. It had never been done before. There they were, facing an event that could continue a year filled with tragedy, or perhaps maybe be a success. Nobody knew. Nobody knew what was going to happen. The country held its breath as everybody watched this launch, and the spaceship went off, and they made it to the moon. They got to the moon's orbit on Christmas Eve. And then they had to do something that I just learned about, which was they then had to launch into lunar orbit, which meant they would continue to go and go to the other side of the moon. This was what they had prepared for. This is what everybody was working up toward. There was just something else that had to happen. They had to have a lot of courage, and they had to have a tremendous amount of faith. Because everything that they had planned, they had to make sure they were pointed in the right direction, and then they just would go. And during that time when they go into that lunar orbit, all communication with them stops. You could see all these people at the Kennedy Space Center just holding their breath. People in front of their televisions waiting in silence, complete silence, as they went into this other lunar orbit, and they were waiting to hear from them. Everything was silent. And then the silence broke. And the astronauts reported that they were there. They'd made it to the other side of the moon. They even sent pictures. And you could hear these cheering that was erupting in this space center. And they even showed pictures of people watching it. There was just so much excitement that they had made it to the other side of the moon. And they televised the whole thing. It was really, really interesting to watch. One of the reporters asked one of the astronauts, "Can you say something? Can you say something?" They could report this all the way up there in space. And the astronaut responded by reciting the first 10 chapters from the book of Genesis. And he said, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God saw that it was good." You could feel from this small snippet of film a collective sense of joy, mystery, and an overwhelming sense of relief, but also hope. This last week of 1968 became one of the most hopeful moments that anyone could ever have imagined. As I watched Dan Rather, who was reporting and then also speaking about the events, he went on to say that this moment in history reminded all of them that darkness does not last. Even Walter Cronkite, they showed him, who ended his year end of constant reporting about war and death. He also ended his news report, and he said, "Let there be light in the firmament of heavens." So says Genesis. It would be really easy to pick apart this reading from the Old Testament, to pick apart this Genesis reading. Adam and Eve banished for eating this forbidden fruit. We could just continue the questions that we ask all over and over again. Why did God create Adam and Eve only then to create a serpent that would ultimately ruin everything? And how come God didn't know where they were hiding? And how come God didn't know what's going to happen? And honestly, was it really all of Eve's fault? I mean, we watch Adam just throw Eve right under the bus. What was he doing? What was Adam doing? Theologians have battled these questions for centuries. And I've gotten to a place where I sometimes feel that all these questions diminish the hope of this story. Trying to solve any of those questions continues to put God up there and us down here. Yes, God banished Adam and Eve, but if we get caught up in the details of this little story, we often can forget the takeaway. We can forget what is really going on here. If God is so angry with Adam and Eve, why didn't he just banish them and then start all over again? He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. God sends them away, but he stays with them. We know that. God continues to be with them. His creations were still living in the world. Eden was gone, the world was created, and they were living in it, just like us. But God, he never left them. In the year of 1968, and in many years in our country, in our world, when it seems that we just are facing crisis after crisis, and the news seems just filled with one bad story after the next. Often I've heard people say, where is God and where is all the hope? It's only lost. We only lose God and we only lose the hope if we get caught up and forget that God is still present. God doesn't leave us in any darkness unless we choose to stay there. In 1942, John Steinbeck wrote a novel, The Moon is Down. And it was a story about the occupation of a small town in Norway by an unnamed army that was at war with England and Russia. And while John Steinbeck never names the army or what's going on, it was very similar to the occupation of Norway at that time by Germany in World War II. The book was made into a film, made into a film later in the 1940s. And in one very difficult scene, and it's very hard to watch, the town had spent some time trying to figure out how they could sort of fight against this invasion, and they planted a bomb in one of the mines. And the bomb went off, and as you can imagine, many, many people were arrested. And you see this scene of everybody in the town gathering in the town center, and in the background, you could see everybody that the soldiers have arrested, and they're being led off you could see this, and you know what's happening. You could see them being led off in the background to the stockade, and you know that they're going to be killed. And that's in the distance, and then you see everybody gathering. And all of a sudden, out of the crowd, you begin to hear one person begin to sing, "A mighty fortress is our God." And it's just unbelievable, because then everybody slowly starts joining in. And then they turn their backs to the soldiers and look upward to heaven, and all of a sudden the whole town is singing, "A mighty fortress is our God." A mighty fortress is our God. What incredible words to sing when they're seeing such despair, to see that glimmer of hope. Darkness covers the land. Darkness can cover our lives, but darkness does not last. We can see the light. We only see darkness when we separate ourselves from God. It is in the midst of the most darkest of places where God is most present. But we have to allow ourselves to sit in the silence and listen for God. Adam and Eve heard God, but then they went and hid. There's no reason to hide. Evil, or as it called in the garden, serpents, exists and will always be among us. But it will never win over the hope that God promises through Jesus Christ. That hope is the faith, the Spirit that moves and lives among us. And that hope started from in the beginning to 1968 to today, in the beginning. Because there will always, always be light in the firmament of heavens. For so says the Lord.